The Ottoman Sultan controlled 3 continents. He commanded armies of 1,000,000 men, but his most terrifying power wasn't over empires or enemies. It was over the 400 women locked inside his harem. Every night a silver tray appeared, carrying folded papers with women's names. The Sultan's finger would hover, choose, condemn. Because being selected wasn't an honor, it was a death sentence with silk sheets. But here's the part that will haunt you. After each encounter, 12 black eunuchs would surround the woman like vultures. The chief eunuch would lean close and whisper the question that sealed fates. Should the seed be preserved? One word from the Sultan. Life or death decided in a heartbeat. If he said no, what followed stripped away every pretense of romance. Brutal medical procedures forced removal of his essence. The woman's body was violated again, this time by men with cold instruments and colder hearts. Yet that wasn't the worst fate awaiting these prisoners. Unauthorized pregnancy meant the sack punishment, sewn alive into weighted leather, thrown into the Bosphorus like garbage. The dark waters hold hundreds of women whose only crime was being fertile without permission. Even menstruation became deadly. If discovered during her cycle, the punishment was silk strangulation. Clean, quiet, no blood on sacred palace floors. The mathematics were simple. 400 women entered. Maybe 10 would bear children. Perhaps 3 would survive to old age. The rest? Forgotten bones beneath Turkish soil. Roxelana changed everything. A Ukrainian slave girl who broke every rule, shattered centuries of tradition, and clawed her way from nameless property to Empress of the world's greatest empire. This is her story. This is how she survived when 400 others didn't. This is the deadliest game ever played. The Ottoman imperial harem was not merely a collection of beautiful women. It was a miniature empire operating under a ruthlessly precise hierarchy, where every step on the ladder of power was carved in blood and ambition. At its apex stood the Valide Sultan, a woman whose influence could topple grand viziers and reshape the destiny of nations. She controlled the imperial purse strings, approved marriages for palace women, and possessed the terrifying authority to order executions with a mere gesture. Directly beneath her authority operated the Kizlar Ağa, whose power extended far beyond the harem's gilded gates into the highest circles of government. These African guardians possessed vast wealth, controlling religious endowments, commanding trade networks, and accumulating fortunes that rivaled those of provincial governors. They answered to no one save the Sultan himself, making them perhaps the most feared men in the empire. Within this suffocating system, the women themselves existed in carefully stratified ranks that determined everything from the silk of their garments to the very air they were permitted to breathe. At the bottom crawled the Kariye, slave girls aged 12 to 16, snatched from their homes across the Circassian mountains, Georgian valleys, Ukrainian plains, and Balkan villages. These children arrived at Topkapi Palace as trembling cargo, their former lives erased, their survival dependent entirely on their ability to please their superiors. Those who demonstrated intelligence and grace might ascend to become gedikli. Women granted basic education in Ottoman Turkish, court etiquette, and the delicate arts of embroidery and music. They served the higher ranks while desperately competing for the slightest imperial attention, knowing that beauty alone was never enough. Cunning and political awareness were equally vital weapons. The fortunate few who achieved Iqbal status had tasted imperial favor, but remained trapped in agonizing uncertainty. Would the Sultan remember their names? Would he summon them again? One level higher waited the Gözde, women who had won repeated attention and earned their own apartments within the maze of corridors. Yet even these privileged few lived in constant fear of losing their position to a younger, more captivating rival. At the pyramid's pinnacle stood the Haseki Sultan, women who had achieved what thousands could only dream of, bearing the Sultan a child and securing their place in history. These imperial mothers commanded armies of servants, influenced state policies through whispered suggestions, and wielded the power to destroy enemies with calculated precision. But in this golden prison housing over 400 rooms, every woman, regardless of rank, shared one inescapable truth. Their fate rested entirely in the unpredictable desires of one man, whose whims could elevate them to paradise or condemn them to a living death in forgotten chambers. Each evening, As the muezzin's call to prayer echoed across the Golden Horn, a ritual began that would determine the fate of hundreds of souls trapped within Topkapi's walls. The Kislar would emerge from the shadows carrying an ornate silver tray, its surface gleaming with the weight of destiny. Upon this tray lay small pieces of parchment, each bearing the delicately scripted name of a woman whose very existence hung in the balance. This was no game of chance. This was calculated power, where every selection carried political implications that could reshape the empire. The Sultan's choice was never truly spontaneous. Behind each name lay careful consideration. Which family alliance needed strengthening? Which faction required reward? Which woman possessed the beauty or intelligence to serve the empire's greater purposes? When the Sultan's finger touched a particular parchment, he was not simply choosing a companion for the night. He was making a decision that could elevate a slave girl to nobility or condemn a rival to oblivion. The moment her name was selected, the chosen woman would receive the most feared and coveted summons in the empire. But what followed was not celebration. It was the beginning of a suffocatingly strict ritual that would strip away every trace of her individual will. First came the purification ceremony, a process so elaborate it bordered on religious devotion. The woman would be led to the imperial baths, where she would immerse herself in water infused with Damascus rose petals and precious oils of amber and musk. Every inch of her body would be scrubbed and perfumed until her skin gleamed like polished marble. Her hair would be combed with golden combs studded with pearls, then arranged in the intricate styles that pleased the Sultan's eye. But here lay the first cruel irony of imperial favor. After this elaborate beautification, she would be draped in the finest Byzantine silk, deep blues that rivaled the Bosphorus at dawn, rich crimsons that matched the Sultan's royal robes. Yet she was forbidden to wear a single piece of jewelry. No earrings with hidden compartments for poison, no rings that might conceal deadly powders, no necklaces strong enough to strangle in a moment of passion or rage. The Ottoman court had learned from centuries of palace intrigue that beauty could mask the deadliest intentions. When the time came to approach the Sultan's chambers, the chosen woman faced her final test of submission. She could not walk upright like a free person. Instead, she must advance on her knees, her eyes cast downward, her voice silent unless specifically commanded to speak. This was not merely protocol. It was a deliberate breaking of her spirit, a reminder that regardless of her beauty or intelligence, she remained property of the Sultan's will. The Sultan's chambers themselves were a study in calculated intimidation. 12 black eunuchs would position themselves around the room's perimeter, their presence both protection and warning. These men had witnessed countless women enter these chambers. They had seen favorites rise and fall, had watched as imperial passion transformed into deadly indifference. Their eyes missed nothing. Every gesture, every expression, every sound was noted and potentially reported. Ottoman nights could extend indefinitely if the Sultan desired. Some women would be dismissed within minutes, their hopes crushed before they could even speak. Others might find themselves chosen to remain until dawn, a privilege that could signal the beginning of lasting favor or merely the Sultan's temporary whim. The cruel mathematics of imperial desire meant that for every woman who experienced these chambers, hundreds more waited in their rooms, listening for footsteps that might never come, hoping for a summons that could transform their lives forever or destroy them completely. Within the Sultan's private chambers, the illusion of intimacy dissolved into a carefully choreographed performance of power and submission. 12 black eunuchs positioned themselves like silent sentinels around the room's perimeter, their presence transforming what might appear to be a romantic encounter into a state-monitored ritual. These men had witnessed the rise and fall of countless favorites. They had seen imperial passion ignite and extinguish with terrifying swiftness. Their eyes recorded every whisper, every gesture, every sign of pleasure or displeasure that crossed the Sultan's face. The chambers themselves were designed to reinforce the absolute nature of imperial authority. Rich Persian carpets muffled every footstep, while silk tapestries absorbed the smallest sound. The Sultan reclined on cushions of Byzantine purple, elevated above his chosen companion, who must remain kneeling unless specifically commanded otherwise. Even in moments of apparent tenderness, the hierarchy never disappeared. She was reminded constantly that she existed solely for his pleasure and convenience. Throughout these encounters, the chosen woman walked a treacherous line between submission and seduction. Too much eagerness could be interpreted as presumption. Too little enthusiasm might suggest disrespect. She must respond to his desires while never appearing to anticipate them, must display passion while maintaining perfect control over her emotions. A single misjudged sigh or misplaced touch could transform imperial favor into deadly displeasure. The presence of the eunuch guards added another layer of psychological pressure. These men understood the delicate politics of the harem better than anyone. They knew which women posed threats to established favorites, which had powerful families seeking influence, which possessed the intelligence to become dangerous allies or enemies. Their silent observation meant that every moment in the Sultan's chambers became part of a larger calculation about palace intrigue and political survival. But perhaps most cruelly, only the Haseki Sultan, women who had already achieved the highest rank, were granted the extraordinary privilege of spending entire nights in the imperial bed. All others, regardless of their beauty or the Sultan's momentary passion, would eventually hear the soft footsteps of eunuchs approaching to escort them back to their own quarters. This seemingly small distinction carried enormous significance, broadcasting to the entire harem hierarchy exactly where each woman stood in the Sultan's affections. The ultimate irony of these chambers lay in their contradiction. They promised intimacy while delivering surveillance, offered the possibility of love while enforcing the reality of possession. Within these walls, the most powerful man in 3 continents reduced human connection to a carefully monitored transaction, transforming even desire itself into another instrument of imperial control. After each intimate encounter, as the Sultan's breathing returned to normal and the chamber fell into heavy silence, the Kizlar would approach with the weight of an empire's future resting on his shoulders. His question, delivered in barely more than a whisper, held the power to transform a slave girl's entire existence. Should the seed be preserved? This was not a medical inquiry. It was the ultimate expression of imperial control over life itself. The Sultan's response would determine whether a woman's body would be allowed to fulfill its natural function, or whether the possibility of conception would be ruthlessly eliminated before it could take root. In that moment, hanging between the Sultan's yes or no, lay the difference between ascending to the motherhood of a potential heir or remaining trapped forever in the limbo of unfulfilled possibility. When the Sultan's answer came as a cold no, what followed was a procedure that stripped away any pretense of intimacy or tenderness from what had just occurred. The chief eunuch would summon his assistants, and together they would implement a system of prevention that was both medically calculated and psychologically devastating. Using knowledge passed down through generations of palace physicians, they would employ specialized herbal preparations designed to prevent the implantation of any fertilized seed. The physical process was invasive and humiliating. Pressure would be applied to specific points on the woman's abdomen, followed by internal manipulations intended to expel any trace of the Sultan's essence. But the true cruelty lay not in the physical discomfort, it was in the timing, the clinical efficiency, that transformed what moments before had been presented as imperial favor into a cold medical procedure that denied her very humanity. Yet this system created opportunities for corruption that some eunuchs exploited with disturbing regularity. The process, which should have taken mere minutes, could be deliberately prolonged by unscrupulous guards who used their authority to satisfy their own twisted desires for power and control. Women subjected to these extended treatments found themselves trapped between reporting the abuse, which would mean certain exile or death, and enduring violations that went far beyond medical necessity. The political implications of reproductive control extended far beyond individual suffering. Each potential pregnancy represented a shift in palace power dynamics that could elevate entire families or destroy established alliances. A woman who successfully bore the Sultan a son could transform from property into one of the most powerful figures in the empire overnight. The title of Haseki Sultan carried with it not just personal elevation, but the ability to influence state policy, control vast wealth, and determine the fates of rivals and allies alike. This knowledge created a desperate mathematics of survival among the harem women. Some would attempt to circumvent the system entirely, secretly consuming fertility-enhancing herbs, or finding ways to retain traces of the imperial essence despite the eunuch's efforts. Others would engage in elaborate deceptions, bribing guards with promises of future rewards, should they ever achieve high rank, or offering immediate compensation in the form of jewelry smuggled from their families. But perhaps most tragically, the system meant that for every woman who successfully navigated these treacherous waters to achieve motherhood, countless others would spend their entire lives knowing that their wombs had been deliberately kept empty, their maternal instincts forever denied by the calculated cruelty of imperial politics. If you believe that all women in the Ottoman harem eagerly awaited the Sultan's summons, think again. There were times when being chosen was no different from receiving a death sentence, particularly during what palace whispers called the Forbidden Days, those monthly periods when a woman's body became, in the eyes of Islamic law, najis, or ritually impure. For modern women, menstruation is a natural part of life. But within the rigid confines of Ottoman palace protocol, it represented something far more dangerous, a source of spiritual contamination that could bring divine wrath upon the Sultan himself, the shadow of God on earth. If a concubine was summoned during her monthly cycle, and the Sultan discovered blood during their encounter, the consequences would be catastrophic. At best, she would face permanent banishment from imperial favor. At worst, she could be executed for defiling the sacred person of the Sultan. In this world where women's bodies and destinies were controlled down to the smallest detail, survival demanded the mastery of subtle deceptions and carefully crafted signals. The women of Topkapi developed an intricate language of warnings that evolved across the centuries, each method more ingenious than the last. During the early Ottoman period, when the harem protocols were still developing, concubines would wear silver bracelets engraved with the crescent moon symbol, a delicate indication that they were observing their lunar cycle and should be excluded from selection. Palace eunuchs who understood these signals would discreetly remove such women's names from consideration, sparing both the Sultan's dignity and the woman's life. As the empire reached its golden age under sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent, these warning systems became more sophisticated. The palace instituted the takvimi, the moon calendar, where each woman would privately mark her inconvenient days on personal charts kept by the chief eunuch's trusted assistants. This bureaucratization of biological realities represented perhaps the ultimate expression of Ottoman administrative precision, turning even the most intimate aspects of women's lives into matters of state record-keeping. But the most dangerous game played within the harem was bedel gundam, the sending of substitutes. This desperate gambit involved finding another woman of similar appearance and billed to take one's place in the Sultan's bed. The practice required not only physical resemblance, but also incredible courage from both women involved, as discovery would mean certain death for both the imposter and the original. The success of such deceptions depended entirely on the Sultan's attention to detail and his familiarity with the woman in question. For concubines who rarely received imperial summons, the chances of successful substitution were higher. The Sultan might not remember their precise features or voice. However, for established favorites, such attempts were virtually suicide, as the Sultan would immediately recognize the deception. The corruption inherent in these systems created opportunities for both survival and exploitation. Eunuchs who controlled access to the Sultan could be bribed with gold smuggled from families, promises of future advancement when a woman achieved high rank, or even more intimate forms of compensation that skirted the boundaries of what Islamic law would permit. These transactions created complex webs of obligation and loyalty that could determine a woman's fate for decades. Some of the most successful concubines became masters of multiple survival strategies simultaneously. They would maintain careful records of their cycles, cultivate relationships with sympathetic eunuchs, identify potential substitutes among the newer arrivals, and even develop networks of mutual assistance with other women facing similar challenges. The tragic irony of these elaborate deceptions lay in their necessity. Women were forced to become experts in subterfuge not to gain advantage, but simply to avoid destruction. In the Ottoman harem, intelligence was not a path to advancement. It was a requirement for basic survival in a system designed to reduce human beings to instruments of imperial pleasure and political calculation. But that was not the most terrifying aspect of harem life. Hidden behind the ornate tiles and golden latticework of Topkapi Palace lay punishments so severe that even whispered rumors of them could reduce grown women to trembling silence. The Ottoman Empire had perfected the art of making people disappear without leaving traces, and the harem served as both laboratory and theater for the most refined forms of psychological and physical destruction. The most chilling method of execution within the palace walls was known as boğdurma, strangulation by silk cord. This was not mere brutality disguised as mercy. It was calculated precision designed to eliminate problems while preserving the sacred principle that royal blood should never be spilled within the sultan's residence. The condemned woman would be summoned to what she believed was another imperial encounter, only to find herself facing the chief executioner with his deceptively beautiful weapon, a cord of the finest Byzantine silk that would steal her breath as quietly as morning mist. The religious justification for this method lay deep within Islamic law, which held that spilling blood within the sacred precincts of the palace would contaminate the entire complex and potentially bring divine retribution upon the Sultan himself. Thus, silk strangulation became the clean method of disposal, leaving no stains on marble floors, no screams to disturb other residents, no evidence that a human life had been extinguished beyond a body that simply ceased to move. For those whose crimes were deemed less than capital, the punishment of eski saray, banishment to the old palace, represented a living death that many considered worse than execution. This crumbling fortress in Bayezid had once housed an earlier generation of imperial women, but by the height of the Ottoman period, it had become a repository for the forgotten and the fallen. Women sent to the old palace lived in conditions of deliberate neglect, given barely adequate food, worn clothing, and chambers that leaked during winter rains. The psychological torment of the old palace was perhaps its cruelest aspect. These women had once worn silk and commanded servants. They had felt the Sultan's touch and dreamed of bearing imperial heirs. Now they spent their remaining years listening to the sounds of a city that had moved on without them, knowing that their names would never again be spoken within Topkapi's walls. Many developed forms of madness, talking to invisible companions or creating elaborate fantasies about their eventual return to favor, returns that would never come. The most horrifying punishment, however, was reserved for women who committed the ultimate transgression, unauthorized pregnancy. The çuval cezası, the sack punishment, involved sewing the condemned woman into a leather sack, weighted with stones, and casting her into the dark waters of the Bosphorus. This method served multiple purposes. It eliminated the evidence of illegitimate conception, prevented the contamination of palace grounds with execution blood, and created a public spectacle that would deter others from similar transgressions. Historical records suggest that hundreds of women met their deaths this way, their bodies joining the countless secrets that the Bosphorus had swallowed over the centuries. The execution would typically occur at night with only the chief eunuch and a handful of trusted executioners present. The woman would be drugged beforehand, a small mercy that prevented her from fully comprehending her fate until the cold water began seeping through the leather. Other punishments, while not fatal, were designed to break the spirit completely. Public flogging with specially designed whips that left permanent scars served as both punishment and warning. Haircutting, the removal of a woman's crowning beauty, marked her as fallen and eliminated any hope of future imperial favor. Demotion to servant status meant that former concubines would spend their remaining years scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots for women who had once been their equals. Perhaps most insidiously, the palace employed punishments that appeared merciful, but were psychologically devastating. A woman might be forgiven her transgression, but placed under permanent surveillance, knowing that every word she spoke, every friendship she attempted to form, would be reported and analyzed for signs of future disloyalty. This created a living prison where the bars were invisible but absolutely unbreakable, where hope became the cruelest torment of all. Yet in this world of perpetual terror and calculated cruelty, some women discovered that survival required more than mere submission. It demanded the cultivation of forbidden alliances that could mean the difference between protection and destruction. The very system designed to isolate and control the harem's inhabitants also created opportunities for the most cunning among them to forge relationships that operated in the shadows of imperial authority. At the heart of this underground economy of favors lay the complex relationship between concubines and their eunuch guardians. These men, stripped of their manhood but granted tremendous power over female lives, became the architects of an intricate web of mutual dependence that violated every official protocol of the palace. The rüşvet system, the bribery system, represented far more than simple corruption. It was a parallel government operating within the golden walls of Topkapi. The currency of this shadow realm extended beyond mere gold and jewels, though both flowed freely when families managed to smuggle wealth into the palace through sympathetic servants or corrupt guards. More valuable still were promises of future elevation, whispered assurances that when a woman achieved the rank of Haseki Sultan, those who had aided her rise would find themselves richly rewarded with positions of influence, grants of land, or marriages advantageous to their own family networks. Some transactions crossed boundaries that Islamic law would theoretically prohibit, yet the isolation of the harem created its own moral universe, where survival trumped religious stricter. Women learned to offer precisely calculated forms of intimacy, a hand placed strategically during conversation, a glimpse of ankle while adjusting robes, words spoken with deliberate breathiness that could inflame desire in men who had been denied complete sexual expression, while remaining technically within the bounds of what palace protocol might overlook. The Kislar himself, despite his theoretically incorruptible position as guardian of imperial virtue, often found himself the center of these webs of influence. His power to arrange imperial encounters, modify selection schedules, or simply provide advance warning of the Sultan's moods, made him perhaps the most courted figure in the entire palace complex. Those who won his favor discovered that their names appeared more frequently on the silver selection trays, that their chambers received better furnishings, that minor infractions of palace etiquette might be overlooked or forgiven. But these alliances carried their own terrifying risks. The same eunuch who protected a woman's interests today might tomorrow find it advantageous to betray her confidences to curry favor with a rival faction. Women who had shared their deepest secrets, their family connections, their political observations, could wake to find themselves accused of plotting against the Sultan based on information they had trustingly revealed to their supposed protectors. The most successful survivors learned to cultivate multiple relationships simultaneously, while never fully trusting any single alliance. They played patrons against each other, shared different pieces of information with different contacts, and maintained careful records of who owed them favors and who might represent future threats. In the harem's deadly mathematics of loyalty and betrayal, today's protector could become tomorrow's executioner, with the simple shift of palace politics or imperial whim. These deadly games of alliance and betrayal were constrained, however, by the rigid protocols that governed life within Topkapi's walls. But there existed brief, precious moments when the suffocating machinery of palace control would loosen its grip, when the Sultan departed the capital for his summer retreats, and the carefully maintained facade of imperial protocol would finally crack to reveal glimpses of something approaching human spontaneity. Each year, from June through September, the unbearable heat of Istanbul would drive the imperial court to seek refuge in the cooler palaces of Edirne. Far from the sweltering confines of the Golden Horn, these seasonal migrations represented more than mere comfort. They became windows of opportunity that the shrewdest women had learned to anticipate and exploit with desperate hunger. During these summer months, the elaborate rituals that normally governed imperial encounters would gradually dissolve into something far more fluid and unpredictable. Gone were the silver trays of names presented with ceremonial precision. Absent were the rigid schedules that determined who might be summoned and when. The Sultan, freed from the watching eyes of the full palace establishment, could indulge in impulses that the formal protocols of Topkapi would never permit. In the gardens of Edirne Palace, concubines might find themselves invited to join hunting expeditions that would have been unthinkable within the capital's walls. Riding alongside the Sultan through forests and meadows, they could speak freely about subjects that palace etiquette normally rendered forbidden: poetry, philosophy, even their memories of the distant homelands from which they had been taken as children. These conversations, unfiltered by the presence of recording eunuchs or competing favorites, sometimes blossomed into genuine connections that could transform a woman's entire trajectory within the imperial hierarchy. The Sultan's famous hunting parties became legendary among the harem women for their relative informality. Selected concubines would dress in practical riding clothes rather than ceremonial silks, would sleep in tents beneath the stars rather than in monitored palace chambers, would share meals around campfires where the usual precedents of rank might be temporarily forgotten. For women who had spent years navigating the claustrophobic politics of the harem, these expeditions offered brief tastes of something resembling normal human interaction. Yet even these moments of apparent freedom carried their own dangers. The very intimacy that made summer journeys so appealing also created opportunities for jealousy and resentment among those left behind. Women who failed to receive invitations would spend the months plotting against those who had won the Sultan's traveling companionship, ensuring that the return to Topkapi would bring new rounds of accusation, sabotage, and revenge. The cruel mathematics of imperial favor meant that every moment of happiness extracted from these summer interludes would be paid for with interest upon the court's return to the capital's unforgiving protocols. But amidst all these tales of survival and suffering, one woman's journey stands as perhaps the most extraordinary testament to the possibility of transformation within the Ottoman system's seemingly impenetrable walls. Her story began not in the gilded chambers of Topkapi, but in the distant fields of Ukraine, where a 15-year-old girl named Alexandra Lisovska was torn from everything she had ever known and thrust into a world that would either destroy her completely or elevate her beyond her wildest dreams. When she arrived at the palace in 1520, this red-haired girl possessed nothing but her wits and an iron determination that would soon earn her the name Hurrem, the cheerful one. But cheerfulness, as she would quickly learn, was merely the first weapon in an arsenal that she would spend decades perfecting. Where other women saw only the prison walls of their golden cage, Roxelana perceived a complex machine that could be understood, manipulated, and ultimately conquered by someone clever enough to master its hidden mechanisms. Her first strategic insight was perhaps the most crucial. Beauty alone would never be sufficient for lasting success. The harem contained hundreds of women whose physical perfection could rival that of legendary goddesses, yet most would live and die in complete obscurity. Roxelana understood that the Sultan's body could be won through allure, but his mind would require altogether different tactics. She threw herself into learning Ottoman Turkish with obsessive dedication, progressing from halting phrases to eloquent poetry within mere months. But language was only the beginning. While other concubines focused their energies on competing for the Sultan's nocturnal attentions, Roxelana cultivated talents that would make her indispensable during his waking hours. She mastered the oud and filled his chambers with haunting melodies that reminded him of her presence even when she was absent. She composed verses that flattered his ego while demonstrating an intelligence that intrigued rather than threatened his masculine authority. The elimination of her primary rival, Mahidevran Sultan, required a campaign of psychological warfare so subtle that its victim never fully understood how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered. Rather than engage in direct confrontation that might have backfired, Roxelana employed a strategy of patient undermining. She would praise Mahidevran's beauty in public while making seemingly innocent observations about the older woman's advancing age. She would express concern for Mahidevran's son Mustafa while subtly highlighting the superior qualities of her own children. Most brilliantly, Roxelana recognized that her greatest obstacle was not any individual rival, but the Valida Sultan herself, Hafsa Sultan, who viewed this Ukrainian upstart as a dangerous threat to established order. Where direct confrontation would have meant certain destruction, Roxelana chose a path of elaborate deference that gradually transformed suspicion into grudging respect and eventually into genuine affection. She would spend hours listening to the older woman's stories, would personally prepare delicate Ukrainian pastries for Hafsa's private enjoyment, and would demonstrate such perfect respect for imperial protocol that criticism became increasingly difficult to justify. The corruption of the eunuch establishment required perhaps the most delicate touch of all. Roxelana understood that these men, stripped of the possibility of dynastic ambition, were motivated primarily by the accumulation of wealth and influence. Rather than offering immediate bribes that might have been seen as crude attempts at manipulation, she created a network of mutual obligation that stretched across years and involved entire extended families. She would remember the birthday of a eunuch's sister living in distant Anatolia, would arrange for medical care when illness struck their relatives, would provide dowries for their adopted daughters' marriages. The historical breakthrough came in 1534 when she achieved something that no concubine in Ottoman history had ever accomplished. She convinced Suleiman to formalize their relationship through an actual marriage ceremony. This decision shattered centuries of tradition and created political shockwaves that reverberated throughout the Islamic world. Other sultans had loved their concubines, had elevated them to positions of great honor, had granted them enormous influence, but none had ever made one his legal wife. This unprecedented elevation provided Roxelana with a platform for influence that extended far beyond the harem's walls. She began corresponding with European queens, engaging in diplomatic initiatives that served Ottoman interests while enhancing her own reputation for wisdom and sophistication. She commissioned architectural projects that bore her name, established religious endowments that would perpetuate her memory, and gradually inserted herself into political discussions that had previously been reserved exclusively for male ministers. Yet perhaps her greatest achievement was ensuring the succession of her son Selim, despite his being younger than Mustafa and lacking the military experience that Ottoman tradition typically demanded in an heir. Through a combination of political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and careful timing, she orchestrated events that would ultimately place her bloodline on the imperial throne. Yet even Roxelana's remarkable legacy could not prevent the inevitable transformation that would eventually sweep away the world she had conquered so masterfully. The 19th century brought winds of change that would prove more devastating to the traditional harem system than any individual intrigue or imperial whim had ever been. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-1800s introduced Western legal concepts and administrative structures that fundamentally challenged the absolute authority upon which the harem system depended. European ideas about individual rights, legal equality, and governmental accountability began seeping into Ottoman intellectual circles, creating pressures that the palace walls could no longer contain. Sultan Abdulhamid II, who reigned from 1876 to 1909, represented perhaps the last serious attempt to maintain the classical harem traditions in their full splendor. His reign saw elaborate ceremonies, continued expansion of palace facilities, and the preservation of ancient protocols that had governed imperial domestic life for centuries. Yet even he could not ignore the growing influence of reformers who viewed the harem as a symbol of everything backward and oppressive about the old order. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 marked the beginning of the end. These nationalist reformers, inspired by European models of governance and social organization, saw the imperial harem as an embarrassing relic that had no place in the modern state they envisioned. When they finally seized power, the dismantling of the harem system became not merely a political necessity, but a symbolic declaration of Turkey's commitment to joining the contemporary world. By 1924, when Topkapi Palace opened its doors as a museum, the last traces of the system that had once controlled the destinies of thousands had been reduced to tourist curiosities and historical artifacts. The Ottoman imperial harem, ultimately, was not a paradise of oriental luxury as Hollywood fantasies might suggest. It was a world where human beings were reduced to chess pieces in games they could never fully comprehend. Every move, every whisper, every stolen glance had to be calculated against the possibility of survival or destruction. Power always came with the price of freedom. Intelligence became a shield rather than a gift. And sometimes, silent cunning was the only weapon that could preserve another day of existence, however fragile that existence might be. Roxelana's story reminds us that even within the most oppressive systems, the human spirit can find ways to transcend its circumstances. Her legacy speaks to something universal about resilience, ambition, and the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. In our modern world, where freedom of choice seems self-evident, the voices of these forgotten women whisper across centuries, reminding us never to take our liberty for granted, and never to underestimate the power of those who seem powerless.